Wanted to bring up two headlines that indicate exactly how relevant Matt's talk is. These were on the Associated Press wire just this weekend. This is from Sunday. First is U.S. wartime prison network grows into legal vacuum for 14,000, 13,000 of them in Iraq. And the story adds that 70 to possibly 90% are not guilty of anything. So that's 10,000 people we have in prison in Iraq for no reason whatsoever. And we wonder why there's an insurgency. And the other is AP photographer detained 5 months in Iraq without charges. And this is about Bilal Hussein, who is a photographer for AP, who actually won the Pulitzer Prize 2 years ago. No, last year. And as I said, he's been in jail 5 years, and he is one of hundreds. 5 months. 5 months. And he is one of hundreds of journalists who have been arrested and detained for very little reason in Iraq over the last 3 years. I'm sure Matt will mention the magazine too, but I will make a plug is if you don't subscribe to the Progressive, subscribe to the Progressive. It's one of the best magazines in America. Brilliant writing, Molly Ivins and Eduardo Galeano, and so. And they really, really need our support as we need a magazine like The Progressive out there desperately. And just finally, in introducing Matt, I can recall at the very first Bob Fest, and that was about 4 years ago, that we actually debated whether the United States was a fascist state or not. Now, I maintained by that point, so I was prescient, that yes, it was. He was not quite certain. He saw it heading in that direction. Since then, he has started writing the McCarthy Watch for the Progressive, so he has moved towards, well, actually, it's kind of unfortunate that I think we're recognizing that we are in a fascist state, and that's certainly just one of the many reasons we should have impeachment. And so with that, Matt Rothschild.
Thanks, John, Bex, Wayne, and Dick, and everyone for coming. It's great to be back here. Thanks to everyone in the Racine Coalition for Peace and Justice. I admire all the good work you're doing. You know, John, I just cannot resist that because I still don't think we're in a fascist state. I do think we're closer than we were 4 years ago, but if we were in an actual fascist state, I would be arrested as soon as I walked out the door, and maybe everybody else here would be too. I don't think we should exaggerate how bad things are. I don't think we should underestimate it either, but to call this a fascist state in comparison to the actual fascist states of Nazi Germany or of Mussolini's Italy, or if you want, Pinochet's Chile, I think disrespects those who suffered under those regimes. But I do think we need to be very mindful of how far we slip down toward that terrible place. And so I think you're right to raise that, and it is one of the reasons we need to have impeachment, because our very system of democracy is at at stake. I don't know how many people watched Bush's speech today at the United Nations. I get paid to watch him. My wife won't watch him for a minute. She is so revolted by the man and his policies and everything that he stands for, and his entitled personality besides. So one of us watches, and that's me. But I was watching at the office today, and well, there are many amazing things about the speech. One is its belligerence. I mean, he clearly indicated that Iran, and maybe now Syria too, are in his sights before he leaves office. And I do think unless we can restrain this man through impeachment or other legal nonviolent means, including civil disobedience in the streets, this guy is going to go from one war to the next. That's how he ricochets around, and I'll explain, I hope through the course of the evening, why maybe he's doing that. But, so that was one thing. The other thing that he mentioned was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and what a shocker that was. I didn't even think he knew that thing existed, but it was a relief for me to hear the President of the United States recognize that founding document of international human rights. The problem is, I think you only read the first sentence of it, of the preamble, because that was the only part of the document that he quoted. And of course he didn't quote the parts of the document of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that relate to what John was talking about, detention without charge, that relate to what he and Cheney have been going up Capitol Hill in bloody footsteps to talk about, which is torture and degrading and humiliating punishment, because that's what he still wants to be able to do, or have the CIA do. And both of those things are completely outlawed right there in the Declaration, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so too, that anybody who is detained gets a trial with all the requisite protections that people are entitled to, and he doesn't want to give those either in these military tribunals. So the idea that he talked about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I guess, was a good thing, but I wish he had studied it, or I wish the person who shoved that sentence into his speech today could have given him the whole document to read before he goes to bed tonight. There are a lot of problems we have with the president as a personality. One of them is Molly Ivins, who's been writing a humor column for The Progressive for the last 20 years. On the last page, the little icing on the cake we give people is, maybe a C student just isn't good enough. That's what Molly says. And I think that's been demonstrated over the last 6 years. I mean, the guy is not up to the task. We saw that on his face when he was reading My Pet Goat on 9/11. And, you know, we see it in his speech, which is just an embarrassment for anyone who reveres the English language, or language itself, as I do as an editor for 25 years. I like to make sure that the sentences are constructed properly and that the grammar is correct. And wow, to hear him today talk about the Iraq people as though they're a tribe or a race unto themselves instead of the Iraqi people was a bit horrifying. Yesterday, out of all things, a literacy convention, for him to say our goals is education and freedom was a bit of a stumbler. But you know, the problem we're facing, though, goes beyond his inability to speak the mother tongue. The problem really is greater than that, and part of it is his delusions. I mean, he is truly a deluded man. He's deluded in the power that he has and that has corrupted him, but he's deluded in a religious way, too, because he actually does believe that God put him in the Oval Office. And he told a group of Amish people in 2004 on the campaign trail that God speaks through me. Whereupon Molly Ivins said, wow, that's strange. I thought God could conjugate subject and verb better than that. But, you know, it's a problem. For the Iraq War, he's been talking about how it is divinely inspired. He has said innumerable times, and you can find this on whitehouse.gov, that we, the United States, are delivering the gift of freedom to the people of Iraq, but it's not our gift to deliver, it's the gift of God Almighty. So he sees himself as God's delivery man, God's little UPS man. And that is a very difficult concept to accept in a democracy that is supposed to have a separation of church and state. Because how actually do you debate someone who says he's getting the word from God? I mean, I suppose the only thing you can say is, you know, you misunderstood what God was saying. You know, listen to the recording again, or, you know, get a better reception. I mean, I don't know what you say. And that's a real troubling thing. So he's not real bright. He's aggressively anti-intellectual. This goes back to his Yale days when I don't think he liked the smarter kids in the class who were showing off their smarts, and he thought that that was ostentatious or something, or he couldn't keep up, and so he made fun of them. Anyway, he's kept that going. And that's not a good combination. On top of that, he has delegated his powers to one person above all, and that person's Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney is, in all intents and purposes, the President of the United States. We're in the second term of the Cheney-Bush administration. And Cheney has enormous weight. It is Cheney who brought Rumsfeld. It's Cheney who brought Wolfowitz. It's Cheney who brought John Bolton. It's Cheney who brought this torture policy in. It's Cheney who pushed the Iraq War to the heights of misleading propaganda. It was Cheney who said that, you know, Saddam Hussein had not only reconstituted his nuclear weapons program, but actually had nuclear weapons when everyone in the intelligence community and the International Atomic Energy Commission said that Saddam Hussein not only didn't have a weapon, he didn't even have a program at this stage. So this is Cheney. Cheney is pushing this Iran thing too. And I just don't understand why, if you get to be the most powerful person in the world, you're just going to pass your power on. The only thing I can really conceive of is the following. First of all, you got to remember about Cheney and how he got where he was. Cheney was Bush Sr.'s defense secretary, and has always had a knack for ingratiating himself with people in power. And so when George Sr. realized that the wrong son, the less qualified, the less intelligent son, was actually going to get the presidential nomination from the Republican Party, because it was always going to be Jeb. That's what George Sr. and Barbara always thought. But here, the governor of Texas was going to get it, and he knew he was going to need some adult supervision. Daddy did. And so he called in Cheney, who's always been a good right-hand man, and had Cheney do a national search for a vice presidential candidate. So Cheney was in charge of that. He brought in governors, he brought in senators, he brought in members of the House, he brought in former cabinet members, including Donald Rumsfeld, incidentally, to interview for the job. And then he turned around and looked in the mirror and said, "I'm the fairest of them all." And so he gave himself the job, and I think he had the following conversation with George Jr. saying, look, being president is just not that hard a job. All you've got to do is give a speech or two a day, meet a foreign dignitary a couple times a week, and then, you know, you can ride your bike and jog and lift weights, and I'll do the real heavy lifting of governance. And that's the deal they've had, really, from the very beginning, and I still see it going on to this day. Cheney says, Cheney, who was elected by the American people, if you believe they ever were fairly elected, and that is really a debate to have for another day, about Florida in 2000, about Ohio, and also New Mexico and Iowa in 2004. Cheney says he has a constituency not of 275 million Americans, he has a constituency of one. He says, all I have as a constituent is the President of the United States. That's the only person I answer to. So reporters trying to figure out who's on Cheney's staff even cannot get the list of Cheney's staff people. That's private information. Dick Cheney, just as the energy report, private information. Scary man. So let's look at impeachment, and let's expand what we're looking at, because we can't settle for just impeaching George W. Bush. We got to take Cheney too. Cheney's been involved in every single illegal action that George W. Bush has committed. In fact, he has been the author of almost all of them. And so when we talk about impeachment, we need to remember that Article 2, Section 4 says the President of the United States may be the President of the United States, the Vice President, and other civil officers. They made room for Cheney. They made room for Rumsfeld. We can take him too. May be impeached for what? Treason, bribery, and high crimes and misdemeanors. It used to be at the original session of the Founding Fathers at the Constitutional Convention, the phrase was more limited. It was just limited to treason and to bribery. And some of the people at the convention said, this isn't good enough. George Mason said, we need something that talks about maladministration. And that Madison thought was too big a term, because it would, and Hamilton thought, you know, one faction might just use its power in a petty way to say that the president hadn't been doing a good job of administering. And certainly Katrina is maladministration. But Katrina isn't on my list of impeachable offenses. It might be on some other people's. But I want to stick to things that are really what Mason finally settled on, which was a concept of subverting the Constitution. He said we need a term that will encompass the act of the president or the vice president, really trying to undo what all we're here trying to do at the Constitutional Convention, and that is subvert this system of government that we are establishing. And so they settled on the term of high crimes and misdemeanors to cover the very act of subverting the Constitution. And that's what George W. Bush and Dick Cheney are doing. They are subverting the Constitution. We have a system of 3 branches of government, and Bush and Cheney have been systematically trying to saw off the other 2 branches. This is the unitary executive gone crazy. So they want to exclude Congress. They don't want to get permission from Congress, and they want to ignore the court. Or to the extent that they need to go to Congress, they want to go to Congress so that Congress exempts them from the decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court, of the Geneva Conventions, or whatever restraining body there is left on the President of the United States. And my worry here, the reason I think we're going down the hill toward a fascist situation, or toward an authoritarian situation, or toward a monarchy again, is because Bush doesn't respect the people's will. He doesn't respect the system of checks and balances. He doesn't respect the balance of power. He wants all the power to himself. That's the notion of the unitary executive. The President of the United States really doesn't need to answer to anybody and can essentially do what he wants. And that's what Bush has been doing, whether it's war or whether it's policy. Not enforcing the law, subverting the Constitution. So I want to enumerate 5 reasons for impeachment, the 5 most compelling ones, in my mind. And before I do that, I'm going to take my coat off because it's warm in here. And so the first one, of course, is the Iraq War. And the Iraq War is an impeachable offense for a couple reasons. First, it's an impeachable offense because the war itself is illegal. It was a war of aggression. A war of aggression breaks the UN Charter. As Kofi Annan himself said, it was an illegal war because the UN Charter says you can only attack one country if that country's attacked you already. International lawyers grant an exception in international law for the imminence of an attack. If another country has marshaled its soldiers on your border and is about to attack, there is an exception you can have. That's where you have a preemptive war. This wasn't a preemptive war. This was a war of aggression, which at Nuremberg was called the biggest war crime of all. And George W. Bush has committed the biggest war crime of all by waging this aggressive war. And it was also an unconstitutional war where there was collusion between the president and, let's be frank, Congress, and the way this war was undeclared. Because Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution says Congress has the sole power to declare war. Congress hasn't declared war here. Congress hasn't declared war since World War II. And that's one of the reasons we've really lost our democracy here, or are losing our democracy. Fighting Bob LaFollette, who founded the Progressive magazine, wasn't content with Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. He said that wasn't a big enough obstacle for the United States lunging into crazy wars that were going to be counterproductive and dangerous. He said we should go to a plebiscite of the whole American people, that everyone should be able to vote before we go to war. And in fact, he introduced legislation that never passed to amend the Constitution that way. So you can imagine what Fighting Bob LaFollette would say today with the way George W. Bush sent us into war without a formal declaration. So that's one. The other is the way he brought us into this war, by lying. He dragged this country into war on a leash of lies. Henry Waxman, a Democrat representative from California, has compiled a list of 237 false or misleading statements that Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Rice, Tenet, and Colin Powell made in the lead up to the war, when they knew that those statements were either false or misleading. Now, to dupe a country into war has got to be one of the biggest crimes that a president of the United States can commit. It was to commit a fraud and to engage in a conspiracy to commit a fraud against the American people and against the Congress of the United States. So that's why this Iraq War is such an impeachable offense. And look at the costs of the war. I mean, the costs of the war are painful to tabulate, aren't they? Especially the human costs. Those are the ones that tug at us the most, aren't they? You know, here we have now almost 2,700 U.S. soldiers dead, 20,000 U.S. soldiers wounded, and Iraqi civilians who Bush said he was there to liberate, anywhere between 40,000 and 140,000 Iraqi civilians killed, more than 17,000 Iraqi civilians killed already this year in the violence that has erupted after Donald Rumsfeld infamously said stuff happens, right? They criminally have occupied the country. They have carelessly and recklessly let the country go to hell. And the human costs are just so dramatic. On top of that, there's the monetary costs here. Remember, the Iraq War was supposed to be self-funding. Wolfowitz said that the oil in Iraq would pay for the war, even though we weren't supposed to talk about oil because it wasn't about oil at all. But it turned out that actually Iraq does sit on the second largest oil supplies in the world, and that's one of the reasons we were there. Actually now in some of Bush's and Cheney's speeches these days, you can see them use the term oil again. For the longest time it was a dirty little three-letter word that couldn't be uttered by anyone senior in the White House. But now it is, because they're saying, what if Iran, which also has some of the largest oil and natural gas deposits in the world, what if Iran gets a nuclear weapon and has all this oil strength that can blackmail us? That's what Bush said. Even though we've got 10,000 nuclear weapons and they don't have one, that's a weird way to blackmail someone. But anyway, it's supposed to be self-funding. What does it cost us? $300 billion already. And the most outrageous thing about this country, or one of the most outrageous things about this country vis-a-vis this war, is there's always $300 billion for war in this country. Isn't that just incredible? $300 billion for war, and there's never enough money for universal health care. There's never enough money for free college education. There's never enough money to end poverty in this country, or to make sure that 30 million Americans don't have to go in hunger or go to a soup kitchen sometime during a year. And they always give us this budget blackmail deal. Speaking of blackmail, they'll say, oh, we can't spend $50 billion a year, which is all it would cost extra for universal health care, because it would ruin the budget. The budget's already in deficit, or the budget will be worse in deficit. We can't afford it. But we can always afford an illegal war that costs $300 billion. That is one of the most shameful things about this war. The other costs of the war are obvious too. Costs to our reputation. The United States after September 11 was the source of universal sympathy. Almost everybody around the world, whatever race or religion or nationality, felt for the American people because of that horrible assault by Al-Qaeda. And what has Bush done with that? He's totally squandered it. You know, now there are countries we practically can't go to as tourists because people have such disgust with our policies. And our relations with our allies are frayed, and what has this done with our image abroad in the Arab and Muslim world? It has been ruinous, this Iraq war. This Iraq war, in combination with what I call the American-Israeli invasion of Lebanon, has really combined to make the United States persona non grata in a lot of parts of the Arab and Muslim world. Worse than that, it has incensed millions and millions of people. And a percentage of those people are going to take up arms against us, are going to join the Al-Qaeda recruiting line, or join Hezbollah in an assault, maybe, against the United States, either here or somewhere overseas. It's made us less safe. This war in Iraq every day is making us less safe. Even the CIA acknowledged that the war in Iraq has proven to be a recruiting call for Al-Qaeda, where they go and work with live ammunition against live targets, American targets a lot of times, to perfect their military training skills. That's the cost of an illegal Iraq war. So that's one of the grounds for impeachment. Another one, again, John referred to it, and I don't think it gets enough attention. It's been getting some attention the last couple days. New York Times today has a story about a Syrian-born Canadian citizen who was detained and flown in this terrible euphemism of extraordinary rendition. This guy was disappeared American style. This guy was kidnapped by the U.S. At JFK. He was simply on vacation with his family in Tunisia. He had left from Ottawa. He was flying back to Ottawa. He made the mistake of flying through JFK. He was grabbed by the U.S. He was not allowed to make a phone call for 5 days. He finally got to call the Canadian consulate. They came to see him a couple days later, and he said, I'm worried they're going to send me to Syria where they're going to torture me. And the Canadian consul said, no, they'll never do that. They did that a couple days later. And he, for 10 months, was in a Syrian grave, essentially. It was like 3 feet by 4 feet by 7 feet, with rats and cats on top of it, pissing down on him sometimes, he said. And he was beaten badly with rubber cables the first 2 weeks he was there. He was not a terrorist. The Canadian government has just come out with a report saying he had no relation to terrorism whatsoever. And so the second grounds for impeachment is this detention policy of the U.S. government. The detention policy has many elements. One is extraordinary rendition. Another is the roundup of Iraqis that John talked about, 13,000 of them, 10, 11, 12, 13,000 Iraqi men taken when the U.S. military raids a town and goes in and drags every male who is 16 years, between 16 and 65 practically, and sends them to a prison, Abu Ghraib, many of them. So that's another kind of detention. There was the CIA detentions in secret prisons around the world where the Red Cross was not allowed to go, which is another violation of the Geneva Conventions, which states that the Red Cross has the right to go and visit every detainee to make sure that person's being properly treated. And there were detentions here in the United States, let's not forget. There were the detentions of 5,000 Arabs and Muslims who weren't citizens in the United States after 9/11. They were rounded up. They were detained without access to lawyers, without any due process rights. Remember, we're supposed to be able to see a judge within 48 hours if we're picked up. These people weren't allowed to see a judge, a lawyer, or call their family for days, weeks, sometimes months. They were housed in metropolitan detention centers in New York and other places, often terribly mistreated. I have a book coming out called You Have No Rights, and in that book I cite a testimony from an Egyptian who was here, and he was picked up, sent to the Metropolitan Detention Center in New York. He was just in his apartment with some friends. He wasn't a terrorist. He was dragged into the door, through the doors, and there was an American flag, and they forced his face up and banged his head up against the American flag and made him kiss the American flag, and then they brutalized him in his cell. Finally he said, what about my human rights? And they said, you have no rights. You have no rights. Isn't that a shocking thing to be said by someone in authority here in the United States? It was said also by guards at Guantanamo. You have no rights, they said to the detainees there. And then there were other kinds of detentions here in the United States, the detentions of U.S. citizens. And I'm talking now about two in particular, Jose Padilla and Yasser Hamdi, who were grabbed, U.S. citizens, denied their due process citizenship rights, held in solitary confinement for more than 2 years in military brigs without getting to talk to their lawyers or see a judge. Why were they held in solitary confinement when they were in a military brig? I mean, clearly they weren't going to be a threat to anybody. Well, I had the misfortune of reading a Justice Department brief to the Supreme Court on their policies of detention of Hamdi and Padilla. And one of the lawyers of the Justice Department, the brief was signed by the Solicitor General, said that we're doing that for humanitarian purposes, holding them in solitary confinement. Because that way they won't suffer any of the more negative consequences that they might have suffered otherwise. You know, these guys they'll throw up anything. They'll throw anything against the wall. They don't care how arrogant or how fallacious their arguments are. It's just an assertion of blatant executive power. And so sometimes they've got no case to make, so they make stuff up like it's for humanitarian purposes. So that's the detention policy that is such an impeachable offense. And closely connected, of course, to the detention policy is the torture policy. The policy that George W. Bush himself is responsible for when he said shortly after the Afghan war began that The Taliban and Al-Qaeda are not entitled to the protections of the Geneva Conventions, when in actual fact, the Geneva Conventions cover everybody. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which he seemed to have excavated today, covers everybody. The Conventions Against Torture and Mistreatment covers everybody. But Bush unilaterally asserted that, hey, they don't, I'm not going to follow it. Donald Rumsfeld in December of 2003, I think it was, said that, signed a document that said that U.S. Interrogators can use dogs against detainees. We saw what dogs were like at Abu Ghraib, didn't we? And Rumsfeld said they could use so-called stress positions, another great euphemism where they hang people up by their arms, or they make them either dangle or stand that way for hour upon hour at a time. And the wise ass, who is the defense secretary, wrote in his own handwriting on that memo, on that order, can't we, what's the matter with this? You know, I stand up all day long at my desk anyway. I mean, that's as sympathetic as he got. Finally, he had to retract that when lawyers at the Navy complained about it so badly. But and then Rumsfeld set out a whole list of things that they could do. They could have sensory deprivation, they could be hooded, they could have temperature, grotesque temperature changes. Many people were held in very cold and then very hot, and then thrown ice water on if it was cold out, and left to shiver and almost freeze. So, and then of course there is waterboarding. Waterboarding, which Bush to this day still wants to be able to let the CIA do. That the CIA director says is not actually torture, he says. If that's not torture, I don't know what is. This is a medieval torture practice that's been perfected by the CIA now. In Latin America, it was called El Submarino. Basically what they do is they strap someone to a board with his back on the board, and they dump the person into a vat of water and hold that person there for about a minute until the person thinks he's about to drown. They lift the board up, they ask the question that they want the answer to. If they don't get the answer they want, they put the person back underwater, and they repeat and repeat and repeat. And eventually either the person drowns, and they're not supposed to drown someone, or the person gives them the story that they want, which isn't necessarily the true story. This is the fallacy of torture. You'll say anything to stop the torture. Maher Arar, the Syrian-born Canadian citizen who was in that rat-infested cell in Syria, he signed a false confession just to stop the torture. Lighting cigarettes out, putting lit cigarettes out in the ears of detainees at Guantanamo, that's torture. This isn't just a frat boy prank gone wrong, as Rush Limbaugh would have us believe. This is torture. This is blatant torture. And it's not even just a torture scandal, it's also a homicide scandal. Because some of the detainees, when they were mistreated by the U.S. guards and the U.S. interrogators and the U.S. soldiers, died. According to the Pentagon itself, there have been 24 homicides by U.S. personnel of detainees who were powerless, captives. This is the most shameful blot on the U.S. record that George W. Bush and Dick Cheney have spilled. And we're going to have to be living with this for a long time too. What right, what standing are we having in the world when another country, and this is Colin Powell finally woke up, Colin Powell's point and McCain's point, what right do we have to tell another country not to mistreat our soldiers if they capture them, their dissidents if they capture them? We've got no standing whatsoever. That's the torture scandal. Then another really blatant impeachable offense is this NSA spying scandal. From a legalistic perspective, this may be the worst and most obvious, because the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act says the exclusive means, the only way that the U.S. government can tap our phones if we are U.S. citizens here in the United States is by first getting a warrant from the FISA court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. Now, Bush has a pretty good batting average, a pretty good success rate at the FISA court. In fact, the FISA court had approved 99.97% of the warrant requests from the Bush Justice Department. So it's got to make you wonder, doesn't it? What were they wanting to do that was so vast an invasion of our privacy that they were afraid to go to a court that was giving them 99.97% of everything they asked? It's got to have been pretty bad, has been my conclusion. I mean, maybe they were doing domestic spying for political purposes. Maybe they were doing, you know, spying on all of us. Of course, peace activists have been spied on really blatantly over the last 5 years, and Attorney General Ashcroft said that was okay. He changed the policy to make that legal, so now that you know, every law enforcement agent from the hall monitor in high school up to the Defense Department has got people spying on us. But this FISA scandal, this NSA spying scandal, is so blatantly illegal. George W. Bush has signed an executive order every 45 days saying, I'm not going to obey. This isn't exactly what it says, but this is the import of what it says. I'm not going to go to the FISA court to get a warrant, but I am going to spy on U.S. citizens here in the United States. Exclusive means, and he's not doing the exclusive means. There really is no way around that. And when he said, when this thing became public, that he was going to keep doing that, that really shocked a lot of Republicans. Norm Ornstein of the American Enterprise Institute said this is what Hamilton meant by an impeachable offense. Bruce Fein, who was in Reagan's Justice Department, said this is an impeachable offense. John Dean said this is the first time any president has confessed to committing an impeachable offense. And Bush keeps confessing. And now he's trying to get, what? Congress to retroactively approve it and say that everything that he did with this program, just like everything the CIA did with its torture, is okay and cannot be punished as a crime. Retroactive get out of jail free cards. I've never heard of such a thing, but here they come. And so our rights have been terribly violated by this spying scandal, the magnitude of which I don't think we've seen completely. And I expect there are going to be more revelations to come. I sure wish the New York Times had not sat on this story for 14 months. I do think that the American people had the right to know about this since the New York Times knew about it prior to the election, so that we would have had a more informed electorate about what our government was doing to us. And the media has been shameful all along with these people. The New York Times with the Iraq War was a willing accomplice, letting its front page be used 5, 6, 7 times to funnel lies from the Iraqi National Congress, which was being paid by the CIA and by the Pentagon to lie to us. And then the liars at the Iraqi National Congress would tell the lie to Judith Miller, and then she'd go to the CIA and to Wolfowitz at the Pentagon, who would confirm the lie, and so she'd have her 2 sources, and voila, is a false story in the New York Times. So those are 4 grounds for impeachment. The last one is the signing statements. This is the unitary executive. This is the imperial president. This is the branch of government that's sawing off the other 2 branches. More than 750 times, George W. Bush has signed a bill into law, but not done what he is required to do constitutionally, which is to see that the laws are faithfully executed. It's supposed to go like this. Congress passes a bill, goes to the president's desk. The president has a choice. Either he vetoes the bill, in which case it's not a law, or he signs the bill and it is the law, and the letter of that law from the bill that Congress drew up, he is required to faithfully execute, to enforce, honestly. Well, he's chosen a 3rd option. He puts an asterisk on after his signature, essentially, and writes at the bottom of that bill that he has signed into law that I will enforce this law only to the extent that it doesn't interfere with my rights as Commander-in-Chief, or with my rights as head of the unitary executive. I kid you not, he has written that too. Or my interpretation of the Constitution. I love that one. Because of course it's not for the President of the United States to interpret the constitutionality of a bill passed by Congress. That's the Supreme Court's job. So here he is trying to be the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judiciary branch, all wrapped into one. My friends, I don't think we've ever seen a president usurp so much power, ever in the history of this country, and to do it so brazenly. That's why I think we're at a very scary moment for our democracy. I don't, except maybe when Richard Nixon was drunk in this last term and was fantasizing about bombing either the Brookings Institute or Congress itself or dropping a nuclear weapon on Hanoi, that we were in such peril as far as our constitutional system goes. I don't think the country itself is going to be destroyed, and Bush wants us to fear that the country is going to be destroyed by Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda cannot destroy the country. George Bush can destroy our democracy, though, and that's what he's doing. And so, you know, you think about what makes this country great, and I am suspicious of the concept of greatness when it comes to countries, because I think it fuels this notion of what's nicely called American exceptionalism, what I call the American superiority complex. That we think we are so much better than other people, that we are put here by God, as George W. Bush believes, to deliver gifts of freedom to people, not just on Christmas Eve, but all the time. And that we are so good, so innately good, so innately superior that we can't possibly, you know, do anything wrong, and therefore that we don't need any laws or conventions to restrain us, because either we were immaculately born perfect or we're following God's orders. The calling of our generation, Bush says, and that is, or the calling of our times, or history's call, which for him means God's call, because he said God is the author of all history. But if we are a great country, it's not because we are the strongest country in the world. It's not because we've got 10,000 nuclear weapons. It's not because we're the strongest economy in the world. It's not because we consume, certainly not because we consume 1/4 of the world's resources when we're 1/25 of the world's population. That doesn't make us great. It doesn't make us great that 1% of Americans owns 33% of this country's wealth. That just means we're an unjust society. It doesn't mean we're a great society. The thing that makes us great, if we are great, is our system of government, our system of checks and balances, and our Bill of Rights. And it is those two most precious things, really the only two great things about this country that George W. Bush is destroying. And we can't let him do it. And that's why we need to impeach him. Thanks very much.
You mentioned earlier that you would discuss Bush's motive for going to war with Iran.
With Iran? Well, I think it's part messianism. It's part thinking that, you know, God put him out here to rid the world of evil, as you said, after 9/11. And of course, Iran is one of the charter members in the Axis of Evil Club. And so it's too dangerous maybe for Bush to go to North Korea, because they actually may have some nuclear weapons that they could deliver, but Iran doesn't, so it might be easier for him to knock off the second member of the Axis of Evil than the third, and so that's one reason. Another reason is, and there are combinations of these petty personal or megalomaniacal, or you know, I think these guys really are clinically drunk with power. Megalochaniacs, I call them. But there are material reasons they're there as well. And that is Iran's oil and natural gas. And it's not just to, you know, let ExxonMobil make another $30 billion of profit in the next quarter. There are geopolitical reasons for it. The Pentagon's threat prior to 9/11, the next enemy in view was China. And the Bush administration is still concerned about China. And the Pentagon probably has plans how to deal with China 20 years from now. It is U.S. national security doctrine under the Bush administration that no country can compete with the United States, not just militarily, but also economically. And the Chinese economy is booming. That doctrine is a doctrine of eternal empire. We are always going to be number one. We're not going to let anybody else come near us. And this is how it relates to Iraq and Iran. China, whose economy is booming at about 18% a year and has been for the last 5 or 6 years, used to be energy self-sufficient. Over the last 5, 10 years, as the economy's taken off there, it's needed to import oil. It gets a huge chunk of its oil from Iran and other places in the Middle East. If the United States controls Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran, it can have a little half Nelson on the Chinese government. And so that's part of the plan.
Since Bush's approval rating went up to 44% in the last couple of days, and since America does not or will not recognize the International Criminal Court, what sort of revolution do we have in this country to eliminate this disease?
Well, I mean, I think we need to do what activists have always done in this country when faced with an oppressive government, and that is we need to use every nonviolent channel at our disposal, and whether that means voting for different people, whether it means launching impeachment proceedings, and whether it means having mass civil disobedience. I mean, I think we need to figure out what has to happen here nonviolently to restrain this man before he further shreds the Constitution and goes bombs more countries, kills more U.S. soldiers, and kills more Muslim civilians, innocent people overseas. I mean, it is a real dilemma. It's a dilemma that I've been wrestling with lately as regards the question of Iran, because I'm convinced he's going to bomb Iran. He's going to bomb Iran before he leaves office, unless somehow this madman, these madmen are restrained. The fact that it's illogical doesn't mean a thing to them. Time magazine has a cover this week on Iran and the possibility of a war, and it says it's flat out irrational to do, and it explains all the negative consequences that would flow from it. That Iran, with 75 million people who are very nationalistic, and many of them recognize that the U.S. screwed them over from 1954 when we overthrew the government there and put the Shah in power. They're not going to rush to embrace the U.S. soldiers there if soldiers have to come, and Bush thinks that they can antiseptically bomb and won't have to put any soldiers down there. But Iran's got thousands of suicide squads ready to attack U.S. installations in the Gulf, oil installations in the Gulf, sending troops, their specialist troops, into Iraq. And already Muqtada al-Sadr, the leading firebrand Shiite cleric young in Iraq, has said if the United States attacks Iran, he's going to lead a revolt against the Americans. And so the whole situation will be a mess. And you know what? Rumsfeld has a philosophy about that. Rumsfeld's philosophy is, if you've got a problem, enlarge it. He's got a problem. That's one of his maxims. He's got a problem in Iraq, and so he's going to enlarge it to Iran. And one reason he wants to enlarge it to Iran is he knows he's losing in Iraq. And yet I hear on the radio today, on Wisconsin Public Radio, that they want to get not fewer troops into Iraq, as they promised us early this year, but more troops. And the American people don't want to send more troops over there. But if the United States bombs Iran, and then Iran does something hostile to our troops in Iraq, Bush would be able to make the case to the American people that we need more troops over there. And I talked to a professor, Michael Clare, of peace studies at Hampshire College, who said he thinks that's their theory. It's bad already in Iraq. We need to get more people over there. It doesn't matter if the Iranians attack. In fact, it'll give us an excuse to get more troops over there. Cynical, possible.
You've talked about what's happening today and what has happened. Bush has, what, 2 years to go in office, etc. All of these changes are so immense, and they really are, they're frightening. What do you see as the future? Is there going to be another presidential election?
Well, I think that's, you know, I used to think that was a laughable question. I don't laugh at it anymore. John, you'll be happy to hear that. And that is because, you know, there's no bottom that these people won't stoop to.
Right.
There's just no low they won't stoop to. There's no bottom at that barrel to scrape. I mean, they, you know, if you look at what happened in Florida and what happened in Ohio, if you look at how they lied us into this war, you look at all the violations we've been talking about, you have to wonder. I mean, I don't think that, actually I think Cheney is more diluted and is more of a power whore, excuse the expression, than Bush is. And I think it'll be hard to get Cheney out of there, harder to get Cheney out of there than Bush. Bush would just as soon loaf, you know, in the comfy, exclusive club of ex-presidents. And he likes clubs. He's a Yale clubby preppy. I mean, you know, so for him to be able to walk around the world, you know, fly around the world with his dad and Bill Clinton, and you know, that's fun for him. It's not fun for Cheney. Cheney is going to die either when his heart gives out or when he leaves power, because power is oxygen to him, and he can't survive without it.
We seem to have forgotten about Afghanistan, and that seems to have gotten worse, but I also understood why we went into Afghanistan. I'm a peace activist, but I understood that. But I'm also wondering about the gas prices. They seem to be going down.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, are they gonna go up again after the election?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, you know, there are two forces that have an interest in bringing, bringing the oil prices down. The Republicans, George Bush included, and the oil companies who have done so great under Bush Cheney. I mean, Bush Cheney's been the best thing for the oil companies since the Model T. I mean, there's no doubt about it. They're making money hand over fist here. And so they want Republicans to stay in power. They are Republicans, the CEOs, and they want Republicans to win. So they're not gonna wanna be jacking up the price. And then there are the Saudis. Bush has been cozy with the Saudis, and the Saudis know that. In 2004, they pumped oil out of the ground as fast as they could to keep the price down, and I imagine they're doing the same thing now. I won't be surprised a bit. There are other forces at work in the oil markets, and that some of the instability seems to be lessening in the global oil markets, but I'm not even sure that's valid. I mean, I hear that, I read that in the Wall Street Journal, but, you know, it looks like the U.S. is gonna go to war against Iran. Chavez in Venezuela is being as troublesome for the Bush administration anyway as he's been in the past. I don't know about oil in Nigeria, I haven't studied that recently, but, you know, it's not like everything's hunky-dory all over the globe and we're at this plateau of peace here, and so you can just drill and drill and drill. That's not what's going on. So I do think there's hanky-panky going on in the oil market, no doubt about it. One more question? 2, 3 more?
One of the things that Bush uses as a justification for the abuse of detainees is, these are bad guys that want to kill us, so it's okay to get tough with them. Would you address the fallacy of that argument for a moment?
I sure would. We have the cover story of the next issue of the Progressive. It is called The Fallacy of the Ticking Time Bomb. It's an article written by UW-Madison professor Alfred McCoy, who's got a book out called A Question of Torture. It's his second book on torture. He studied torture in the Philippines and by U.S. trained interrogators. And his argument is very persuasive to me. He says torture rarely works, especially against the most hardened of the terrorists. And it certainly doesn't work the way it does in the Fox show 24, where Kiefer Sutherland, who just got an Emmy Award, you know, can get out the knife that he uses to poke someone's eye out, or you know, I saw one episode, he grabbed a lamp and got the wires to go and used the wires on this guy, and got the guy to confess within about, you know, well, certainly within the hour program. Otherwise the show wouldn't work, you know. They successfully torture someone every week, right? Within that hour. And so that's not how it works. A lot of times the most hardened people don't say anything. Some of them will lie eventually, just to stop it, or will give false information. In fact, Colin Powell relied on a tortured Iraqi who was close to Saddam to rationalize the Iraq War in his UN speech. Or no, it was a tortured Al-Qaeda person, a high-level Al-Qaeda person was tortured until a person said what the U.S. interrogators wanted that person to say, which was that Saddam Hussein was training Al-Qaeda in chemical and biological weapons, which they weren't, but this guy wanted the torture to stop, so he signed the confession. That's how polluted and criminally distorted our intelligence apparatus was. We would torture people into lying to help Bush Cheney go do what they always wanted to do, which was attack Iraq. So the idea that there's a ticking time bomb out there, you'll never get it in time because the torture's not going to work right away. And then he says, and I'm going to be interviewing him if anyone's up within range of 92.1, the Air America station up in Madison. I'm going to be interviewing him at 7:30 tomorrow morning just on this subject. He's for 15 minutes. He says, look, in Vietnam, we tortured a lot of people in the Phoenix program and then killed people. And the consequences are, you can torturing the few doesn't work, because the few really aren't gonna give you accurate information most of the time, aren't gonna break most of them. To the extent they break, they are gonna break more often when the technique is to ingratiate yourself with the person you're trying to interrogate, rather than terrorize the person you're trying to interrogate. And there was a big discussion about this guy named Al-Zubaydah in the New York Times over the last 2 weeks, who the CIA tortured after the FBI had done the good cop kind of thing. And there's a big discussion there as to whether it was helpful having the CIA come in with their brutal torture, illegal tactics, or whether it was harmful. The FBI says it was harmful. So McCoy says torturing the few doesn't work. Torturing the many, like in the Phoenix program, you'll get some information from, you know, if you're gonna go torture 20,000 people at once over a period of a month. But his point is, what does that do to the country that's doing that, and to the reputation of the country that's doing that? In Algeria, the French did that. They had mass torture. They went into the Kasbah and they grabbed everybody and tortured thousands. And the generals reviewing, the French generals reviewing the Algerian Battle of Algiers campaign said, you know, we won the Battle of Algiers with this torture, and we lost the war with this torture too, because it became so untenable politically with the French population.
Speaking to that question, I did hear one comment today, I don't know who asked that question, and talking about our torture and that, well, they torture us, and look what Vietnam did and what occurred, whatever. And the thing was, it's not about them, it's about us.
Right.
And I think that was a
I mean,
good,
and that is,
good,
after
easy
all,
line, yeah.
why Colin Powell, after suffering all the indignities that he suffered, finally came out and said enough's enough, and I'm not gonna go along with this administration anymore.
Yeah.
Because as a soldier, you know, he knew what it would do to other soldiers and what it does to our reputation. And, you know, McCain knows a thing or two about torture too, having been the victim of it. And Warner, who was head of the Navy, you know, when the military guys say stop and the civilian guys say go torture, you gotta wonder, you know, how wise that is. Last,
Matt, I've forgotten the title of your new book.
You Have No Rights. It's supposed to be out in January. I haven't seen the.
Who's the publisher?
The New Press out of New York. It publishes Robert McChesney's books, Studs
Yeah.
Strickland books, things like that. So
New press in January.
I'm looking forward to it.
You have no rights.
I hope it's there. I'll also be on Thursday at 8 o'clock on Wisconsin Public Radio talking about a subject I'm glad no one raised, the 9/11 conspiracy theories, which I don't believe in.
Oh, I love it.
I will leave you with that tease. Thanks very much.
Fits and starts are everywhere. From the mountains of Chiapas to the streets of Central Square, empires fall, this one will too. So here's to the day when this one is through.